Tonight, we travel back through centuries of silence to a time when the Americas held civilizations as complex and sophisticated as any on Earth. Before the steel and horses arrived from across the Atlantic, before the world maps were redrawn, three great empires flourished in the Western Hemisphere: the Maya, the Aztec, and the Inca. These were not simple societies, not primitive peoples waiting for history to find them. They were astronomers and architects, mathematicians and poets, farmers who transformed impossible landscapes into gardens. To understand these civilizations, we must first understand the land itself. Imagine, if you will, the geography of the Americas, stretching from the deserts of northern Mexico down through the rainforests of Guatemala, across the narrow waste of Central America, and then southward along the spine of the Andes Mountains. This is not a gentle, forgiving landscape. These are places of extremes, volcanic peaks that touch the clouds, jungles so dense that sunlight barely reaches the forest floor, mountains so high that the air itself becomes thin and precious. The story begins not with the Maya, the Aztec, or the Inca, but earlier still, with people called the Olmec. Along the Gulf Coast of what is now Mexico, in the lowlands where rivers meet the sea, the Olmec built the first complex society in Mesoamerica. This was around 1,200 years before the Common Era. They carved enormous stone heads from basalt, some weighing as much as 20 tons, faces broad and calm, wearing what appear to be helmets. We do not know who these faces represented, kings perhaps, or gods, or both, for in these ancient worlds, the line between divine and mortal was never quite as clear as we might imagine. The Olmec gave gifts to all who came after them. They developed a calendar system that tracked both the solar year and a sacred cycle of 260 days. They played a ball game in special courts, a ritual contest that would echo through all later Mesoamerican cultures. They carved jade and worked with obsidian, that volcanic glass so sharp it could cut cleaner than modern steel. And then, around 400 years before the Common Era, their cities were abandoned. The great stone heads remained, watching over empty plazas while new peoples moved through the jungle. Among those new peoples were the early Maya. The Maya were never a single empire with one capital and one king. Instead, imagine a constellation of city-states, each independent, each ruled by its own divine lord, yet all sharing a common culture, a common writing system, a common understanding of time and space. These cities emerged slowly during what scholars call the Pre-Classic period, from around 2,000 years before the Common Era until 250 years into the Common Era. Picture the landscape where the Maya built their first settlements. The Yucatan Peninsula stretches flat and limestone white under an unrelenting sun. There are no rivers on the surface here. Instead, the water hides underground in caves and cenotes, those circular sinkholes where the limestone has collapsed to reveal pools of crystal water below. The Maya believed these cenotes were portals to Xibalba, the underworld, the realm of death and transformation. They were not wrong to see them as sacred. In this hot, dry land, water is life itself. To the south, in the highlands of Guatemala and the rainforests of the Petén, the landscape transforms. Here, the jungle grows thick and green, draped over rolling hills and ancient mountains. Howler monkeys call at dawn, their voices carrying for miles through the canopy. Jaguars move silent through the shadows. And here, in clearings hacked from the jungle, the Maya began to build. The early Maya settlements were modest, farmers clearing forests to plant maize, beans, and squash. Simple homes with walls of wooden poles and roofs thatched with palm leaves. But even in these early days, Even when the population was small and the villages scattered, something remarkable was happening. The Maya were watching the sky. In a world without electric light, the night sky is not a distant abstraction. It is immediate and present, a vast black dome scattered with thousands of points of light. The Maya observed that some of these lights moved while others remained fixed. They tracked the path of the sun across the sky, noting where it rose on the horizon each morning, how that point shifted slowly throughout the year. They watched Venus, the morning star and evening star, brightest of all the planets, and recognized its cycle of 584 days. This careful observation of the heavens was not idle curiosity. The Maya understood that the movements of the sky governed the movements of the earth. When to plant, when to harvest, when the rains would come, and when the dry season would parch the land. Time was not an abstract concept to be measured in arbitrary units. Time was sacred, cyclical, alive with meaning. By the late pre-classic period, around 300 years before the Common Era, the Maya cities were growing more complex. At sites like El Mirador, deep in the Petén jungle of Guatemala, massive pyramids began to rise above the forest canopy. The La Danta complex at El Mirador, built entirely by hand, entirely without metal tools or the wheel or beasts of burden, contains more volume than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Imagine the organization required, the planning, the thousands of workers carrying limestone blocks and buckets of mortar up steep stairs, the architects calculating angles and weights, the priests determining the proper alignment with celestial events. These were not tombs, as the Egyptian pyramids were. The Maya pyramids were temples, mountains made by human hands, places where the earthly realm touched the sky realm. At their summits, small rooms with corbelled arches housed altars and images of the gods. Here, the Kurhul Ajor, the divine lord of the city, performed bloodletting rituals to communicate with the ancestors and the deities. Blood was precious. It contained life force, chulel in the Maya language. By offering their own blood, the rulers maintained the cosmic order, ensured the sun would rise, ensured the rains would fall. Life in these early Maya cities followed rhythms both celestial and terrestrial. The farmers worked the milpa, the cleared forest plot where maize grew tall and green. Maize was not merely food, maize was sacred. The Maya believed that humans were made from maize, fashioned by the gods from white and yellow corn. The Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quiché Maya, tells how the gods tried 3 times to create beings who could worship them. First, they made animals, but animals could not speak prayers. Then they made humans from mud, but these dissolved in the rain. Then humans from wood, but these were dry and soulless. Finally, from maize dough, the gods shaped true humans, beings with flesh and thought and gratitude. Around the milpa, the forest provided. Cacao trees grew in the shade, their pods containing the beans that would be ground into a bitter, frothy drink reserved for nobles and used as currency. Copal trees yielded resin that was burned as incense in ceremonies, its smoke rising to carry prayers to the heavens. Wild turkeys could be hunted, deer tracked through the forest paths. The Maya domesticated dogs and kept stingless bees for honey. In the workshops of the growing cities, artisans developed their crafts. They learned to work jade, that green stone harder than steel, carving it into beads and pendants and elaborate ear spools worn by the nobility. They painted pottery with scenes of mythology and daily life, using a palette of reds and blacks and creams. They wove cotton into cloth and created books, what we now call codices, from pounded fig bark covered with a fine layer of lime plaster and folded accordion style. On these pages, scribes wrote in a script of elegant glyphs, each symbol representing a sound or a word or an idea. The Maya writing system is one of the great intellectual achievements of the ancient world. For centuries after the Spanish conquest, no one could read it. The symbols remained beautiful but silent, decorating temple walls and stone monuments. But modern scholars, through patient comparison and brilliant insight, have unlocked most of the script. Now the ancient Maya speak to us again across the centuries. What do they say, these ancient texts? They tell us of kings and their deeds. They record births and deaths, marriages and wars. They describe ball games and ritual performances. They track the movements of planets and calculate dates thousands of years into the past and future. A Maya scribe, working by firelight in a stone room, could tell you what day of the week it had been at the creation of the world, which they placed in the year 3114 before the Common Era. This precision with time reflects something deeper in Maya thought. They believed that time moved in cycles, that history repeated itself in predictable patterns. Every 13 Bactans, approximately 5,125 years, a great cycle completed and the world was renewed. The last such renewal, according to the Maya long count calendar, occurred on August 11th, 3114, before the Common Era. The next would occur on December 21st, 2012, in the Common Era, a date that caused much speculation and some anxiety in modern times, though the Maya themselves saw it not as an ending, but as a transition, the turn of a great wheel. As the pre-classic period drew to a close, and the classic period began around 250 years into the Common Era, the Maya city-states were entering their golden age. Population was growing. Agricultural techniques were becoming more sophisticated, with raised fields in wetlands and terraced hillsides increasing yields. Trade routes connected the cities, with merchants carrying obsidian from the highlands, salt from the coastal evaporation pans, jade from the Motagua River Valley, quetzal feathers from the cloud forests. The cities themselves were becoming grander. Stone architecture replaced simple wood and thatch. Palaces spread across artificial platforms, their rooms decorated with murals showing court life and mythology. Ball courts were built, long narrow alleys flanked by sloping walls. Here, the rubber ball game was played, a contest of skill and endurance with deep religious significance. The ball represented the sun, moving through the underworld. The game reenacted the cosmic struggle between light and darkness, life and death. Each city had its own character, its own patron deities, its own ruling dynasty. Tikal, deep in the jungle, grew to become one of the largest, its temples rising to heights of 60 meters above the forest floor. Calakmul, Tikal's great rival, controlled a vast territory and engaged in generations of warfare and alliance building. Palenque, in the misty hills of Chiapas, produced some of the finest art and architecture of the Maya world. Copan, near the southern edge of Maya territory, in what is now Honduras, became a center of learning, where scribes and astronomers gathered. These cities were connected not just by trade, but by a shared culture and a common aristocracy that intermarried across city boundaries. A princess from Tikal might marry a prince from Copan, strengthening an alliance. The children of noble families traveled to other cities to be educated, to learn from different teachers. Ambassadors moved between courts carrying messages and gifts. Yet for all this connection, the Maya cities never unified into a single empire. Each remained independent, ruled by its own Kahul Ajar, who claimed descent from the gods and performed the rituals necessary to maintain cosmic order. This decentralization was both a strength and a weakness. It allowed for cultural diversity and innovation, but it also meant constant competition, endless small wars, shifting alliances that could change with each generation. As we drift towards sleep, picture this world in its prime. The jungle cities with their white plaster pyramids shining in the sun. The marketplaces full of voices, the smell of copal smoke, the sound of drums and flutes. The farmers in the milpa, the scribes bent over their bark paper books, the astronomers on their platforms, watching the stars wheel overhead. This was a civilization at its height, confident in its understanding of the cosmos, secure in its place in the world. But no height lasts forever. Even as the classic Maya flourished, forces were gathering that would transform their world. In the centuries to come, some cities would fall silent, their pyramids swallowed by jungle. Others would continue, adapting, surviving. And far to the west, in the highlands of central Mexico, other peoples were beginning their own journeys. Journeys that would eventually lead to the rise of the Aztec Empire and reshape the entire region. But those stories wait for tomorrow. For now, rest here in the peaceful green shadows of the Maya forest, where the air is warm and heavy with moisture, where the cicadas sing their endless song, where time moves in sacred cycles, where the ancestors watch from the stars. Sleep now, and let these ancient rhythms carry you into dreams. We return now to the Maya world, entering what scholars call the Classic period, those centuries between 250 and 900 of the Common Era, when Maya civilization reached its most elaborate expression. This was not a peaceful time. It was an age of competition between cities, of artistic achievement, of mathematical precision, and of constant warfare. But it was also a time of stability, of shared culture, of a worldview so complete and coherent that it governed every aspect of life, from the planting of corn to the movements of planets. Let us walk through one of these cities at its height. We will choose Tikal in the heart of the Petén jungle, though we could equally visit Palenque or Copan or Calakmul. Each had its own character, but all shared fundamental features. As dawn breaks over the jungle canopy, the howler monkeys begin their morning chorus, a sound like distant thunder rolling through the trees. The city awakens slowly. Smoke rises from cooking fires in the thatched houses that spread for kilometers around the stone center. Most people in Tikal were farmers, living in these simple homes built on low stone platforms to keep them dry during the rainy season. The walls were wattle and daub, woven sticks plastered with mud. The roofs were thick layers of palm thatch that kept out rain and provided shade from the brutal midday heat. Inside, the homes were dim and cool. There was little furniture. People slept in hammocks or on mats. They cooked over hearths, grinding corn on stone metates each morning. The rhythmic scraping of stone on stone, a sound as old as Maya culture itself. The farmers would leave their homes in the early light, walking to their milpa plots, carrying their simple tools. Maya agriculture was sophisticated, adapted to the challenges of the tropical environment. In the forest, they practiced what is now called swidden agriculture. A section of jungle would be selected and cut during the dry season. The felled trees and brush would be left to dry for weeks, then burned. This burning had multiple purposes. It cleared the land, it returned nutrients to the soil in the form of ash, and it was itself a ritual act, a transformation by fire. In the cleared milpa, the farmers planted. Maize, beans, and squash were the sacred trio. The maize stalks grew tall, providing support for the bean vines to climb. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, enriching it. The squash plants spread their broad leaves across the ground, shading the earth, keeping it moist, preventing weeds. This was ecology and agriculture as one art. Between the main crops, the Maya planted other foods: chili peppers for flavor and heat, tomatoes, avocados, amaranth. The milpa was not a monoculture, but a garden of diversity. A milpa could be used for 2 or 3 years before the soil nutrients were depleted. Then it would be abandoned, left to return to forest, while the farmer cleared a new plot. This system required vast amounts of land and worked well when population density was low. But as the cities grew larger, as more mouths needed feeding, the Maya developed other techniques. In low-lying areas that flooded seasonally, they built raised fields, rectangular plots of earth elevated above the water level and separated by canals. The canal mud, rich in organic material, could be dredged up and spread on the fields as fertilizer. On hillsides, they constructed terraces, level steps cut into the slope, preventing erosion and creating more usable land. While the farmers worked the land, the city center was coming to life in a different way. Here, in the heart of Tikal, massive structures rose above the jungle. Temple 1, the Temple of the Great Jaguar, stood 47 meters high, its steep stairs climbing toward the sky, its roof comb decorated with plaster sculptures of the gods. This temple was built as a funerary monument for Jasor Chan Kawil, one of Tikal's greatest kings, who died in the year 734 of the Common Era. His tomb was placed deep in the pyramid's core, a stone chamber containing his body, along with offerings of jade, pottery, and carved bone. Across the plaza stood Temple 2, built for Jasor Chan Kawil's wife, Lady 12 Macaw. These temples faced each other across the Great Plaza, a vast open space paved with white plaster that must have gleamed almost painfully bright under the tropical sun. Between them, the plaza served as the public heart of the city, a place for ceremonies, for markets, for ball games, for the great rituals that marked the passage of time. The nobility lived in palaces built on raised platforms surrounding the main plazas. These were not single buildings, but complexes of rooms arranged around interior courtyards. The walls were built of limestone blocks, carefully fitted together, covered with plaster and often painted with murals. The rooms were long and narrow because the Maya had not invented the true arch. Instead, they used a corbelled vault, where each course of stones projects slightly inward until the walls meet at the top. This technique limits the width of a room, but allows for great height. Inside these palace rooms, the walls told stories. At Bonampak, not far from Palenque, an entire room is covered with murals showing a battle, the taking of captives, and their eventual sacrifice. The paintings are remarkably detailed. We can see the costumes of the warriors, the expressions on faces, the blood running down temple steps. These murals were not meant to shock or horrify. They were historical records, documentation of events important enough to preserve in plaster and pigment. The daily routine of Maya nobles was structured by ritual and obligation. The Kahul Ajau had to perform ceremonies tied to the calendar. Every 20 days, a new month began, and there were rites to mark the transition. Every 260 days, the sacred calendar completed a round, and more elaborate ceremonies were needed. Every 52 years, when the solar calendar and the sacred calendar came back into alignment, the Maya observed a particularly important festival, much as we might mark the turn of a century. These ceremonies often required bloodletting. The act was performed in a ritual context, with preparation and prayer. A stingray spine or an obsidian blade would be used to pierce the tongue or the genitals, and the blood would drip onto bark paper that would then be burned. The smoke rising from this paper carried the offering to the gods and allowed communication with ancestors in the underworld. This was not primitive superstition. This was theology, a coherent understanding of how the spiritual and material worlds interconnected. The Kahul Ajau was more than a political leader. He was the axis mundi, the center point of the cosmos, the living connection between earth and sky, between human and divine. When he performed the rituals correctly, the world continued to function. The sun rose, the rains came, the maize grew. His legitimacy rested not just on military power or political skill, but on his ability to maintain this cosmic order. Warfare was part of that order. The Maya fought wars for territory, for tribute, for captives. But war was also ritual combat, a reenactment of the cosmic struggles depicted in mythology. The goal was not usually to destroy the enemy city, but to capture the enemy king. When a great lord was captured in battle, he might be held for years, brought out for important ceremonies, and eventually sacrificed in a ritual that transferred his power to the victor and maintained the balance of the universe. One of the most famous of these conflicts was the long rivalry between Tikal and Calakmul. These two great cities vied for dominance over the central Maya lowlands for generations. In the year 562, forces from Calakmul defeated Tikal in a catastrophic battle. Tikal's king was captured and likely sacrificed. For over a century, Tikal was diminished, its monuments uncarved, its temples unbuilt. But in 695, under Jasau Chanka Awil, Tikal rose again, defeating Calakmul and reclaiming its position as one of the great powers of the Maya world. While kings fought wars and performed rituals, scribes worked in quiet rooms, preserving knowledge. Maya writing was both art and technology. Each glyph was a small sculpture, carefully proportioned, pleasing to the eye. The scribes wrote on pottery, on stone monuments called stelae, on the walls of buildings, and on bark paper books. These books covered many topics. There were histories, recording the deeds of kings. There were astronomical tables, tracking the movements of Venus and the moon. There were ritual almanacs, specifying which days were favorable for planting, for marriage, for war. The Maya mathematical system was elegant in its simplicity. They used only 3 symbols, a dot for 1, a bar for 5, and a shell for 0. With these 3 symbols, they could write any number. Their system was vigesimal, based on 20 rather than 10, which meant they thought in larger units than we typically do. A dot in the first position meant 1. A dot in the second position meant 20. A dot in the third position meant 400. The invention of 0 was a remarkable intellectual achievement. Only a few cultures in human history developed this concept independently, and the Maya were among them, probably earlier than any culture in the Old World. 0 is not obvious. It requires abstract thinking, the ability to conceive of nothing as something, absence as a quantity. For the Maya, 0 was not just a mathematical placeholder. It represented completion, the ending of a cycle, the moment before new beginning. This mathematical sophistication served their astronomy. Maya astronomers calculated the length of the solar year as 365.2420 days, remarkably close to the modern calculation of 365.2422 days. They calculated the lunar month. They tracked the synodic period of Venus with extraordinary accuracy. All of this was done through patient observation over generations, with records passed from teacher to student, each generation adding to the accumulated knowledge. The Maya calendar was actually several calendars working together. The harp was the solar calendar, 365 days divided into 18 months of 20 days each, plus a short month of 5 unlucky days at the end. The Tzolk'in was the sacred calendar, 260 days, created by combining 13 numbers with 20 day names. These two calendars meshed like gears, creating a cycle of 52 years before the same combination of Harb and Tzolk'in dates repeated. This cycle was called the calendar round. For longer periods, the Maya used the long count, which measured days from a creation date in 3114 before the Common Era. A long count date consisted of 5 numbers. The first counted Baktons, periods of 144,000 days, roughly 400 years. The second counted Katons, of 7,200 days. The third, Tuns, of 360 days. The fourth, Uinals, of 20 days. The fifth, individual days, called Kins. With this system, the Maya could place any event in a continuum of time stretching thousands of years in both directions. This precision with time reflected a worldview in which past, present, and future were intimately connected. The Maya believed that time was cyclical, that patterns repeated. By understanding the patterns of the past, particularly as recorded in the movements of celestial bodies, they could predict the future. A Venus conjunction that had brought disaster in one era would likely bring disaster when it recurred. Daily life for commoners was less concerned with these cosmic calculations, but still structured by the calendar. Market days occurred at regular intervals. The 8-day period was important for local markets. Farmers would bring surplus produce to trade for goods they could not make themselves. Salt from the coast, obsidian blades for cutting, pottery vessels, woven cloth, cacao beans that served as a form of currency. The markets were noisy, crowded affairs, full of the smells of unfamiliar foods, the sight of goods from distant regions. Women played central roles in Maya society, though their contributions are sometimes less visible in the historical record because most monuments commemorate male rulers. Women wove the cloth that everyone wore, sitting at backstrap looms for hours each day, creating intricate patterns in cotton. They prepared the food, grinding corn, making tortillas, cooking stews flavored with chili and herbs. They raised children, taught them the skills they would need, the prayers they should know, the proper behavior for their station in life. Some women were far more than domestic laborers. There were queens who ruled in their own right. Lady Six Sky of Naranjo, for example, came from the royal house of Dos Pilas and ruled Naranjo for decades, overseeing military campaigns and building projects. Her image appears on monuments, performing the same ritual bloodletting and warfare scenes typically associated with male rulers. Women could be scribes, healers, priestesses. They could own property and participate in trade. The Maya concept of beauty differed from modern Western standards. The elongated, sloping forehead was considered ideal, so infants had their heads bound between boards to shape the growing skull. The eyes should cross slightly, so parents dangled objects before babies to encourage this. Teeth were filed and inlaid with jade. Ears, lips, and noses were pierced for ornaments. The body was painted and tattooed. This modification of the body was not vanity, but a way of displaying one's place in society, one's achievements, one's identity. Music and performance were integral to Maya life. Drums, rattles, flutes, conch shell trumpets provided rhythm and melody for ceremonies and festivals. Dance was prayer in motion. Performers wore elaborate costumes and masks, becoming the gods they portrayed. The ball game itself was a kind of performance, watched by crowds who gathered in the ball courts. The rubber ball, weighing several pounds, could not be touched with hands or feet, but had to be struck with hips, knees, or elbows. The game required tremendous skill and endurance. Players wore protective padding, but still often suffered injuries. The metaphysical stakes of the ball game were high. The Popol Vuh tells of the hero twins who were challenged to a ball game by the lords of the underworld. The twins journeyed to Xibalba and played, using their wits and magical skills to defeat the death gods. Through their victory, they conquered death itself, ascending to the sky as the sun and Venus. Every ball game reenacted this mythic contest, this eternal struggle between light and darkness. As the classic period progressed, the Maya cities grew ever more elaborate. Population increased, more land was cleared for farming. The terraces crept higher up hillsides. The raised fields expanded into swamps. Trade networks stretched from central Mexico to Central America, from the Pacific coast to the Caribbean. Cacao from the Guatemalan highlands, jade from the Motagua Valley, obsidian from the volcanic regions, quetzal feathers from the cloud forests, those iridescent green plumes worth more than gold, reserved for the headdresses of kings. Yet, even at its height, stress was building in the system. The population may have approached levels that strained the agricultural base. Warfare was becoming more common and more destructive. Climate records suggest that the 8th and 9th centuries brought severe droughts to the Maya lowlands, reducing crop yields, drying up reservoirs, creating competition for diminishing resources. What happened next is one of the great questions of archaeology. Beginning around 800 of the Common Era, many Maya cities in the southern lowlands began to decline. Fewer monuments were carved. Building projects ceased. Population dropped. By 900, great cities like Tikal, Calakmul, and Palenque were largely abandoned. Their plazas empty, their temples silent. The jungle creeping back to reclaim what it had lost. This was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual transformation spread over more than a century. The causes were probably multiple and interconnected. Environmental stress from drought and deforestation, political instability as dynasties competed and failed, economic disruption as trade routes shifted, perhaps even ideological crisis, a loss of faith in the rituals and the kings who performed them when those rituals failed to bring rain, failed to ensure prosperity. The southern lowlands were largely depopulated, but Maya civilization did not end. In the northern Yucatan, cities continued and even flourished. Chichén Itzá rose to prominence, blending Maya traditions with influences from central Mexico. Uxmal built some of the most beautiful architecture in the Maya world. The Maya adapted, survived, transformed. When the Spanish arrived in the 1500s, they found Maya cities still occupied, Maya languages still spoken, Maya traditions still practiced. But the great age of the classic Maya was over. The forest swallowed the abandoned cities. Roots worked between stone blocks. Trees grew from pyramids. The monuments stood silent in the green shadows, their inscriptions unread for centuries, waiting for a time when humans would learn again to hear the voices carved in stone. Let that ancient silence hold you now. Rest in the twilight of a civilization that rose and fell and continues still, transformed but unbroken. The pyramids dream in the jungle. The calendars turn their endless wheels. The ancestors watch from the stars. Sleep. We turn now from the Maya world and travel northwest to the high central plateau of Mexico. Here, in a valley 7,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by volcanic peaks that scrape the sky, another civilization rose to power. The Aztec, or as they called themselves, the Mexica. Their story is shorter than that of the Maya, more compressed in time, but no less remarkable. From humble beginnings as wandering migrants, they built in just 2 centuries an empire that stretched from sea to shining sea. The Valley of Mexico in the 1300s was not empty when the Mexica arrived. It was a land with a long history of civilization. The great city of Teotihuacan had flourished here 1,000 years earlier, a metropolis of perhaps 150,000 people, with massive pyramids dedicated to the sun and moon, with wide avenues and elaborate murals. By the time the Mexica came, Teotihuacan was long abandoned, its pyramids silent, but its influence lingered. Later peoples saw it as a sacred place, the birthplace of the gods, and made pilgrimages there. After Teotihuacan fell, other cities rose. The Toltecs at Tula, the Tepanecs at Azcapotzalco, the Acolhua at Texcoco. The Valley of Mexico was a patchwork of city-states, each competing for resources and prestige, none able to establish lasting dominance over the others. Into this complicated political landscape came the Mexica, later rivals with no land, no city, and no particularly distinguished ancestry. According to their own histories, recorded in pictographic books and later written down in alphabetic script after the Spanish conquest, the Mexica originated from a place called Aztlan. Aztlan means place of whiteness or place of herons. Where exactly it was, no one knows. Somewhere to the northwest, perhaps in what is now northern Mexico or the southwestern United States. The exact location matters less than what Aztlan represented. It was the homeland, the place of origin, the mythic beginning of the journey. The Mexica migration story tells of their god Huitzilopochtli, whose name means hummingbird on the left or hummingbird of the south. He was a war god, a sun god, a god of will and destiny. He spoke to the Mexica priests in visions and dreams, guiding them on their journey, promising them that they would find a homeland where they would become great. The sign would be an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. When they saw this, they would know they had arrived. The migration took generations. The Mexica wandered for decades, perhaps even a century or more, moving from place to place, sometimes staying for years before moving on. They were not welcomed. Other peoples already occupied the good land. The Mexica were forced to accept marginal territories, rocky hillsides, swampy ground, places no one else wanted. They served as mercenaries for more powerful groups, fighting other people's wars in exchange for the right to settle temporarily. Finally, around the year 1325 of the Common Era, the Mexica arrived in the Valley of Mexico. They came to the shores of Lake Texcoco, a vast, shallow lake that filled much of the valley floor. The lake was brackish, not good for drinking, but rich with fish and waterfowl. Around its edges, reeds grew thick and tall. And there, on a marshy island near the western shore, the Mexica saw their sign. An eagle on a nopal cactus, a serpent in its beak. The god had spoken. Here they would build their city. The sight was terrible. A swampy island with no stone for building, no fresh water, no trees for timber. But it had advantages. It was defensible, surrounded by water. It was neutral ground claimed by no other city. And the lake itself offered resources. The Mexica set to work. They drove wooden stakes into the muddy lake bottom and built artificial platforms of reeds and mud. On these platforms, they constructed their first simple homes. They dug canals to bring fresh water from springs on the mainland. They built chinampas, the remarkable floating gardens that would eventually feed the entire city. A chinampa is a masterpiece of agricultural engineering. Picture a long rectangular plot built in shallow water. The edges are staked with wooden posts and woven with reeds and branches. Then mud and vegetation are piled onto this framework until it rises above the water level. The chinampa is anchored by planting willow trees around its perimeter. The willow roots grow down through the platform and into the lake bed, stabilizing everything. The rich lake mud provides excellent soil. The water table is always close, so plants never suffer from drought. On chinampas, the Mexica could grow crops year-round. Maize, beans, squash, tomatoes, chilies, amaranth, chia. The harvest was abundant. As the city grew, more chinampas were built, extending out into the lake, creating a landscape of canals and gardens, a Venice of the Americas. Canoes moved through the waterways, carrying produce to market, carrying people from one part of the city to another. At night, fireflies danced over the canals. Frogs sang from the reeds. The city was called Tenochtitlan, meaning place of the prickly pear cactus. For the first decades of its existence, Tenochtitlan was small and poor, subject to more powerful neighbors. The Mexica paid tribute to the Tepanec city of Azcapotzalco, sending goods and warriors as the price for being allowed to exist. But they were learning, growing stronger, making alliances, observing how power worked in the valley. In the year 1428, the Tepanec ruler died, and his son who succeeded him was a tyrant. He increased the tribute demands on subject cities, humiliated their rulers, threatened to destroy those who resisted. The Mexica leader at the time, Itzcoatl, saw an opportunity. He formed an alliance with Texcoco and Tlacopan, two other cities that resented Tepanec dominance. Together, the three cities went to war against Azcapotzalco. The war was brief and decisive. Azcapotzalco was defeated, its ruler killed. The three allied cities divided the spoils and formed what is known as the Triple Alliance, with Tenochtitlan gradually becoming the dominant partner. This moment marked the beginning of Aztec expansion. From a single city on a swampy island, the Mexica began to build an empire. The empire they built was not like the territorial empires of Europe or Asia. The Aztec did not occupy conquered territories with garrisons or impose direct administration over every subject people. Instead, they demanded tribute. A conquered city would be left with its own ruler and its own customs, but it had to send regular payments to Tenochtitlan. Maize, beans, cotton, cacao, precious stones, feathers, gold, jade. And people, warriors to serve in Aztec armies, workers to build Aztec temples. This system was efficient but fragile. The subject cities resented the tribute burden. They remained distinct nations with their own identities, waiting for any opportunity to rebel. The Aztec had to maintain constant military pressure, launching campaigns to punish rebellion, to conquer new territories, to remind everyone of their power. War was not just politics for the Aztec. War was also religion, a sacred duty, a way of capturing prisoners for sacrifice. Human sacrifice was central to Aztec religion, and we cannot understand their civilization without understanding this. The Aztec believed that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world and to set the sun in motion. The gods had shed their blood so that humans could live. In return, humans had to feed the gods with blood. Without this offering, the sun would stop in the sky. The world would end. Darkness and monsters would consume everything. The sun god, Tonatiuh, needed constant nourishment. Each dawn was a battle, a struggle against the forces of night. The sun was a warrior, and like any warrior, he needed strength, which came from human hearts and human blood. This belief led to the practice of large-scale ritual sacrifice, particularly of war captives. The most common method was to stretch the victim over a stone, then cut open the chest with an obsidian blade and remove the still beating heart. To modern sensibilities, this is horrifying, but the Aztecs saw it differently. The person sacrificed was not murdered, but transformed. They became food for the gods. They ensured the continuation of the universe. There was honor in this, even a kind of immortality. The souls of sacrificial victims went directly to the highest heaven, to dwell with the sun. Warriors who died in battle went there too, as did women who died in childbirth. For childbirth, seen as a woman's battle. This theology of sacrifice shaped Aztec warfare. The goal of battle was not primarily to kill the enemy, but to capture him alive. A warrior's prestige came from the number of captives he took. The Aztec even arranged what they called flower wars, ritual battles with other cities, where the goal was explicitly to capture prisoners for sacrifice rather than to conquer territory. These wars allowed warriors to prove their worth and provided a steady supply of victims for the gods. Life in Tenochtitlan at its height must have been extraordinary. By the year 1500, the city had grown to a population of perhaps 200,000 people, one of the largest cities in the world at that time. The swampy island had been transformed into a marvel of urban planning. Broad causeways connected the island to the mainland, wide enough for 10 horses to ride abreast, according to Spanish accounts. These causeways had removable sections for defense and were also aqueducts, bringing fresh spring water from Chapultepec to the city. At the center of Tenochtitlan stood the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple. This was a massive pyramid with twin stairways leading to 2 shrines at its summit. One shrine was dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the war and sun god, the patron deity of the Mexica. The other was dedicated to Tlaloc, the ancient rain god, provider of water and fertility. The juxtaposition was significant. War and agriculture, death and life, destruction and creation. These dual forces sustained the world. The Great Temple was rebuilt and expanded 7 times, each new version completely encasing the previous one, like a Russian nesting doll. Archaeological excavations have revealed some of these earlier versions, along with extraordinary offerings buried in the foundations, sculptures, shells from distant coasts, crocodile skeletons, the skull of a jaguar. These offerings connected the temple to all parts of the empire, making it the symbolic center of the universe. Surrounding the temple precinct were the palaces of the nobility and the ruler, called the Tlatoani, which means he who speaks. The Tlatoani was not a god-king like the Maya Kuhul Ajau, but he was sacred, chosen by the gods, responsible for maintaining proper relations between the human and divine realms. He lived in a palace with hundreds of rooms, courtyards, gardens with exotic plants and animals. He had a staff of thousands. He ate from plates of fine pottery and drank chocolate flavored with vanilla from golden cups. The most famous Tlatoani was Motecuzoma Xocoyotzin, known to history as Moctezuma II. He ruled from 1502 until the Spanish conquest in 1520. Spanish chroniclers described him as grave and dignified, a deeply religious man who spent hours each day in prayer and ritual. He maintained a vast menagerie of animals, aviaries full of bright-plumed birds, ponds with waterfowl, cages with jaguars and eagles. He had a treasury filled with gold and jade. He could command armies of tens of thousands of warriors. The common people of Tenochtitlan lived very differently from their ruler. The city was divided into calpulli, neighborhoods or wards, each with its own temple, its own school, its own communal land. A person was born into a calpulli and usually remained there for life. The calpulli provided identity and security. It organized labor for public works. It ensured that its members had land to farm or a trade to practice. Most men were farmers, though in a city built on a lake, farming meant tending chinampas rather than plowing fields. Others were craftsmen, stonemasons, carpenters, feather workers, goldsmiths, potters. Some crafts were so specialized and valuable that they formed their own guilds, living in special quarters of the city, keeping their techniques secret, passing them from father to son. The feather workers, who created elaborate headdresses and cloaks from the plumes of quetzals and other tropical birds, were particularly esteemed. Their work was art and magic combined. Transformation of natural beauty into objects of power. The marketplace was the heart of economic life. The Great Market at Tlatelolco, Tenochtitlan's sister city on the same island, was one of the wonders of Mexico. Spanish conquistadors who saw it compared it to the markets of Rome and Constantinople. 60,000 people might gather there on a major market day. Every product of the empire could be found there. Gold and silver worked into jewelry, cotton cloth in every color, pottery vessels, obsidian knives and mirrors, tobacco, chocolate, vanilla, chilies, tomatoes, rabbits and turkeys for meat, fish from the lake, salt, honey. The market was organized by goods, each type of merchandise in its own section. Market judges walked through the crowds, watching for cheating, settling disputes. Prices were not fixed by negotiation, but standardized. A canoe of maize cost a certain number of cacao beans. A turkey cost another amount. The cacao beans served as currency, along with small copper axes and pieces of cotton cloth called quachli. There was no coined money, no paper currency, but the system worked efficiently because everyone understood the values. Women played crucial roles in Aztec life, though their status depended greatly on their social class. Noble women could inherit property, own businesses, even in rare cases become high priestesses or healers of great renown. Common women's lives centered on the household. They ground corn, made tortillas, wove cloth, raised children, tended household gardens. This work was essential and valued, but women had fewer legal rights than men and were expected to be modest, obedient, and devoted to their families. Education was important to the Aztec. Every neighborhood had a Telpochcali, a school for common boys, where they learned basic military skills, citizenship, and their people's history. Noble boys went to the Calmacac, an elite school where priests taught reading, writing, astronomy, calendar keeping, rhetoric, and poetry. Yes, poetry. The Aztec loved poetry, seeing it as a way to speak truth, to touch the divine, to create beauty in a transient world. Much Aztec poetry has survived, preserved in books written after the conquest. The poems speak of flowers and friendship, of the brevity of life, of the mystery of the gods. They are often melancholy, aware that everything beautiful must end. One poet wrote, "Do we speak truth here, giver of life? We merely dream, we merely rise from a dream. All is like a dream. No one speaks here of truth." Another wrote, "We only came to sleep, we only came to dream. It is not true. It is not true that we came to live on earth." This awareness of life's impermanence coexisted with tremendous vitality and confidence. The Aztec expanded their empire aggressively. By 1500, they controlled much of central and southern Mexico, extracting tribute from hundreds of cities. But they never achieved complete dominance. The Tarascan kingdom to the west remained independent. The Tlaxcalan city-states to the east resisted all attempts at conquest. And within the empire, resentment simmered, ready to ignite at any moment of Aztec weakness. That moment came in 1519. Strange reports began reaching Tenochtitlan from the east coast. Floating mountains had appeared on the sea. Men with pale skin and thick beards had emerged from these mountains. They had animals like large deer that men could ride. They had weapons that spit thunder and lightning. The Spanish had arrived. Led by Hernán Cortés, a few hundred conquistadors landed on the coast of Mexico, searching for gold and glory. Within 2 years, they would destroy the Aztec Empire, not through their own strength alone, but by exploiting the resentments of subject peoples, by allying with the Tlaxcalans and others who hated Aztec rule. The story of that conquest is complex and tragic, full of misunderstanding, violence, and disease. But that is a tale for another time. For now, rest here in the height of Aztec power, before the fall. Picture Tenochtitlan in the morning light, the white temples gleaming, the canals full of canoes, the causeways busy with foot traffic, the air smoky with incense and filled with the sound of drums and conch trumpets. Picture the chinampas green with crops, the lakes sparkling in the sun, the volcanic peaks standing eternal in the distance. Picture a civilization confident in its place in the universe, in its relationship with the gods, in its ability to sustain the sun and keep the world turning. Rest in this moment of balance before everything changes. Our journey carries us now southward and upward, leaving the lakes and valleys of Mexico for the towering peaks of the Andes Mountains. Here, in the thin air where mountains scrape the sky, where condors soar on thermals rising from glacier-carved valleys, another civilization built an empire unlike any other in the Americas. The Inca, who called their realm Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters. An empire that stretched for 4,000 kilometers along the spine of South America, from modern Colombia to central Chile, united by roads, by language, by an administrative system of remarkable sophistication. The Andes are among the most challenging environments humans have ever chosen to inhabit. These mountains rise abruptly from the Pacific coast, climbing from sea level to peaks over 6,000 meters high in a distance of less than 200 kilometers. The terrain is vertical, broken, harsh. At low elevations, there are fertile valleys and coastal deserts. At middle elevations, temperate zones where crops can grow. Above 4,000 meters, in the Puna, the high grasslands, the air is so thin that newcomers gasp and struggle. Above 5,000 meters, nothing grows. There is only ice and rock and wind. Yet humans lived in these mountains for thousands of years before the Inca. They learned to grow potatoes in hundreds of varieties, each adapted to slightly different elevations and conditions. They domesticated the llama and alpaca, hardy animals that could carry loads up mountain trails and provide wool for weaving. They built terraces on steep hillsides, level steps held by stone walls, creating farmland where none had existed. They developed techniques for freeze-drying potatoes and meat, turning them into chuño and charqui, foods that could be stored for years. The Inca origin story, like that of the Aztec, tells of a migration and a divine mandate. According to legend, the first Inca, Manco Capac, and his sister wife, Mama Oclor, emerged from Lake Titicaca, that vast inland sea high in the Andes, at an altitude of 3,800 meters. The sun god, Inti, their father, gave Manco Capac a golden staff and instructed him to travel until he found a place where the staff would sink easily into the ground. There he should found his city. Manco Capac traveled northward from Lake Titicaca, and eventually he came to a valley where three rivers met. Here the golden staff sank into the earth. Here he founded Cusco, which means navel in Quechua, the Inca language. Cusco would be the center of the world, the point from which all things radiated. The legend is beautiful, but archaeology tells a more gradual story. The Inca began as one small tribe among many in the Cusco Valley, slowly growing in power and influence over several centuries. For most of their history, the Inca were a local power, controlling just the Cusco Valley and some surrounding territory. They fought with neighboring tribes, they made alliances through marriage, they absorbed some groups and were pushed back by others. Nothing suggested they would become more than one kingdom among many. Then, in the year 1438, everything changed. An alliance of enemies attacked Cusco. The Inca ruler at the time fled the city. His son, Cusi Yupanqui, refused to retreat. He rallied the defenders and led a successful resistance. After the victory, Cusi Yupanqui took the name Pachacuti, which means earth shaker, or he who transforms the world. It was an appropriate name. Pachacuti would transform not just the Inca, but the entire Andean region. He began a campaign of expansion that would continue through his reign and those of his successors. Within 70 years, the Inca would control an empire stretching from Ecuador to Chile, the largest empire ever to exist in pre-Columbian America. Pachacuti's genius lay not just in military conquest, but in organization. He understood that holding an empire required more than defeating enemies in battle. It required infrastructure, administration, a system that could bind diverse peoples together. He rebuilt Cusco, transforming it from a town of thatched houses into a capital of stone palaces and temples. He initiated the construction of Machu Picchu, that extraordinary city built on a mountain ridge surrounded by peaks, perhaps as a royal estate or sacred retreat. And he began building the road system that would become the empire's nervous system. The Inca road network was a marvel of engineering. Slightly. Two main routes ran north to south, one along the coast and one through the highlands, connected by numerous cross routes. The highland road, the Capac Ñan, was the most remarkable. It traversed terrain that seems impossible for a road. Narrow ledges carved into cliff faces, rope bridges swaying over gorges hundreds of meters deep, stone stairways climbing straight up mountainsides, tunnels cut through rock. In places where the terrain was simply too steep for any path, the Inca built stone steps, sometimes hundreds of steps in a row, climbing up or descending down. These roads were not wide enough for wheeled vehicles, which the Inca never developed. They were footpaths designed for llamas and human runners, but they were maintained with extraordinary care. Teams of workers assigned to each section kept the surface clear, repaired damage, rebuilt walls. Every few kilometers, there was a tampu, a way station where travelers could rest, find food and shelter. The most important routes had chasqui runners stationed at intervals, a relay system that could carry messages the length of the empire in a matter of days. The chasqui were young men trained for speed and endurance in the thin mountain air. Each runner was responsible for a section of road, perhaps 2 or 3 kilometers. When a message arrived, memorized or recorded on a quipu, the runner would sprint at full speed to the next station, where a fresh runner waited. Through this system, fresh fish from the coast could reach Cusco, 300 kilometers away and 3,000 meters higher, in 2 days. Administrative orders could travel from the capital to distant provinces in less than a week. The quipu deserves particular attention. The Inca had no writing system as the Maya or Aztec did, no alphabet or glyphs. Instead, they used quipus, bundles of colored, knotted strings. A quipu consisted of a main cord from which numerous pendant strings hung. On these pendant strings, knots were tied in specific positions and patterns. Different colors of string, different types of knots, and their positions on the string all carried meaning. We know that quipus recorded numerical information. The position of a knot on a string indicated its place value, units, tens, hundreds. Different types of knots represented different numbers. Quipu keepers, called quipucamayos, used these devices to track the empire's resources. How many llamas in a particular province? How much maize stored in warehouses? How many men available for military service or labor duty? The accuracy was remarkable. Spanish chroniclers who saw the quipus in use noted that they were as reliable as written records. A breath. But some scholars believe quipus recorded more than just numbers. The patterns of knots, the colors of strings, their arrangement might have encoded narratives, histories, poetry. Unfortunately, most quipus were destroyed during the Spanish conquest, and the knowledge of how to read them was largely lost. Modern researchers have made progress in understanding the numerical aspects, but if quipus did record stories and history, that information remains locked away, a vast library we cannot quite read. The Inca economy was fundamentally different from European models. There was no money, no markets in the Aztec or Maya sense. Instead, the economy was based on reciprocity and redistribution. Every household owed labor service to the state, a system called mita. For a certain number of days each year, men would work on state projects, building roads, constructing terraces, mining, serving in the army. In return, the state provided for their needs while they worked, and maintained storehouses of food and goods that could be distributed during famines or emergencies. Land ownership was also different. In theory, all land belonged to the Inca ruler, the Sapa Inca, who was the son of the sun and the living embodiment of divine authority. In practice, land was divided into three categories. Some land was designated for the sun god and worked to provide offerings for religious ceremonies. Some land was state land, worked to fill the government storehouses, and some land was designated for the local community, divided among households for their own use. Families worked all three types of land, but they could use the produce only from the community land. This system required meticulous record-keeping and honest administrators. The Inca developed both. The entire empire was divided into decimal units, groups of 10 taxpayers, then 50, then 100, 1,000, 10,000. Each level had its own official responsible for keeping track of the people and resources in his jurisdiction. These officials reported to higher authorities, who compiled information and forwarded it up the chain to Cusco, where the Sapa Inca and his council could make decisions based on comprehensive data about the entire empire. The Inca did not merely conquer, they transformed. When a region was incorporated into Tawantinsuyu, Inca engineers arrived to build terraces, roads, storehouses, administrative centers. They introduced new crops and new agricultural techniques. They standardized weights and measures. They taught Quechua, the Inca language, which became the lingua franca of the empire, though local languages were not forbidden. Sometimes, if a region was particularly rebellious, the Inca employed a more dramatic technique called mitima. They would relocate entire communities, moving them to different parts of the empire, far from their homeland. A rebellious tribe might be dispersed, with families sent to 3 or 4 different provinces. In their place, the Inca would settle loyal subjects from the heartland. This broke regional resistance and created mixed populations with less incentive to rebel. It was harsh, but effective. Cusco itself was designed as a microcosm of the empire. The city was laid out in the shape of a puma, with the fortress of Sacsayhuaman forming the head, the main plaza the belly, and the district between 2 rivers forming the tail. At the center stood the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun, the most sacred site in the Inca world. The walls were covered with sheets of gold. Inside, a golden disc representing the sun hung on the wall, positioned so the morning light would strike it and fill the room with reflected brilliance. Around the Coricancha, the palaces of the nobility spread across the city. Inca architecture had a distinctive style. Walls built of precisely fitted stones, some weighing many tons, cut and shaped so perfectly that no mortar was needed. The stones fit together with such precision that a knife blade cannot slip between them even after centuries. How the Inca achieved this with stone and bronze tools remains debated. They may have used wooden levers and sand as an abrasive. They may have had techniques for softening stone that we do not understand. What is certain is that the result was buildings of extraordinary durability. Many Inca walls still stand, unshaken by the earthquakes that periodically rock the Andes. Daily life in the empire varied greatly depending on one's location and status. In the High Puna, herders tended flocks of llamas and alpacas, moving with the seasons to find fresh pasture. The llama provided everything: wool for cloth and rope, dung for fuel in a land with few trees, meat for food, and labor, as pack animals that could carry 20 to 30 kilograms up steep mountain trails. The alpaca's wool was even finer, softer, reserved for the finest textiles. In the valleys, farmers worked terraces carved into mountainsides. These terraces were marvels of agricultural engineering. Stone walls held back tons of earth, creating level platforms where crops could grow. Different crops were planted at different elevations. Maize in the warmer valleys, potatoes and quinoa at higher elevations. The Inca grew dozens of varieties of potatoes, each adapted to specific conditions. Some could tolerate frost, some grew best in wet conditions. Some thrived in drier soil. The potato native to the Andes was the foundation of Inca civilization, as maize was for the Maya and Aztec. Potatoes could be harvested year-round at different elevations. They were highly nutritious, rich in carbohydrates and vitamin C, and they could be preserved. The Inca developed a freeze-drying technique, leaving potatoes out at night to freeze, then trampling them during the day to squeeze out moisture. After several cycles, the result was chuño, a dried potato that could be stored for years and reconstituted in soups and stews. Weaving was a highly developed art among the Inca. Every person, regardless of status, wore clothing appropriate to their position. Commoners wore simple tunics of llama wool. The nobility wore garments of alpaca wool and cotton, dyed in brilliant colors. The Sapa Inca wore robes of vicuña wool, the finest fiber in the world, taken from the wild vicuña, a camelid even rarer and more delicate than the alpaca. His robes were woven by chosen women, akla, who lived in houses dedicated to weaving and religious service. These akla, often translated as virgins of the sun, were girls selected for their beauty and skill. They lived in special compounds called aklawasi, learning to weave the finest textiles, to prepare chicha, the fermented maize beer used in ceremonies, and to maintain the sacred fires. Some became priestesses. Some were given as wives to nobles as rewards for service. Some were sacrificed in important state rituals, particularly during times of crisis or at the death of a Sapa Inca. The Inca practiced human sacrifice, though apparently less frequently than the Aztec. The most famous form was capacocha, a ritual where children, usually from noble families, were taken to the summit of high mountains and left as offerings to the gods. In recent decades, archaeologists have discovered several of these children, perfectly preserved by the cold and dry conditions at high altitude. They were dressed in fine clothes, surrounded by offerings of pottery and figurines, their last moments frozen in time. Religion permeated every aspect of Inca life. Inti, the sun, was the primary deity, the divine ancestor of the Inca rulers. But there were many other gods. Mamakila, the moon, Inti's wife and sister. Ilapa, the thunder god, who brought rain. Pachamama, the earth mother, source of fertility. Sacred places called huacas were everywhere. An unusually shaped rock, a spring, a mountain peak. The Inca made offerings at these huacas, burning llama fat, pouring chicha, leaving coca leaves. Coca was sacred to the Inca. The leaves of the coca plant, when chewed with lime, produce a mild stimulant effect. They suppress hunger, combat fatigue, ease the effects of altitude. Coca was used by chasqui runners, by soldiers on campaign, by anyone doing hard labor. It was offered to the gods. It was given as a gift to show respect. The Inca did not extract cocaine from the leaves or use it in concentrated form. For them, coca was simply part of life in the mountains, a plant gift from the gods. The Inca had no writing, and thus no written literature, but they had a rich oral tradition. Professional memorizers, called amautas, preserved the history of the dynasty, reciting the deeds of past rulers during ceremonies. They told stories of creation, of the gods, of heroes and monsters. They composed and recited poetry. These poems were often sung, accompanied by drums and flutes made from bone or cane. Music and dance were important in Inca culture. Every festival included dancing, with different dances for different occasions. Men and women danced separately or together, forming circles or lines, moving in patterns that could involve hundreds of participants. The movements were symbolic, telling stories, honoring gods, marking seasons. Some dances were solemn and slow, others were vigorous and joyful. The sound of panpipes and drums echoed through mountain valleys during festivals. The Sapa Inca was not just a political ruler, but a sacred figure. He was the son of the sun, divine by nature. He married his full sister to keep the bloodline pure, though he also had many secondary wives. When he traveled, he was carried on a litter, his feet never touching the ground. No one could look directly at his face. He wore a special fringe, the lautu, that hung across his forehead, marking his unique status. He dressed each day in new clothes, which were then burned. To wear the same garment twice would be beneath his dignity. When a Sapa Inca died, his body was mummified. The internal organs were removed, and the corpse was preserved with various herbs and techniques. The mummy was then kept in his palace, tended by servants, brought out for ceremonies. His lands and wealth were not inherited by his successor, but remained in the possession of his panaka, his extended family and descendants, who used the income to maintain his cult. This meant each new Sapa Inca had to acquire his own lands and wealth, creating a structural pressure for constant expansion. This system worked as long as expansion continued. By the early 1500s, the empire had reached its greatest extent under Huayna Capac, who ruled from 1493 to 1527. The empire stretched over 4,000 kilometers from north to south. It encompassed deserts, mountains, jungles, and coastlines. It included perhaps 10 million people speaking dozens of languages. It was, in terms of population and territory, one of the great empires of the world. But there were stresses in the system. The empire was so large that it was difficult to administer. Communication took weeks, even with the Chasqui relay system. Rebellions in distant provinces were hard to suppress quickly. And there was no clear rule for succession. When Huayna Capac died, possibly from smallpox brought by Europeans, though he never met a Spaniard, his two sons began a civil war over the throne. This war would weaken the empire, just as an even greater threat appeared on the coast. But that threat, the arrival of Francisco Pizarro and his small band of conquistadors, belongs to the story of endings. For now, rest in the height of Inca power, in the peace of the mountain valleys, in the order of a well-administered empire. Picture the terraces green with crops, climbing the hillsides in perfect geometry. Picture the llama trains on the mountain roads, bells tinkling, carrying goods from one end of the empire to the other. Picture Cusco at dawn, the golden sun disk in the Coricancha catching the first light. Picture a civilization that made the mountains home, that built roads where eagles fly, that created order in the most challenging landscape on Earth. Rest here in the thin mountain air, where the stars are close and bright, where the wind whispers through the puna grass, where the ancestors sleep in their stone houses on the mountaintops. Sleep. We arrive now at the twilight of these civilizations, the moment when worlds collided and everything changed. The Maya, the Aztec, and the Inca had each built remarkable societies. Each had created their own answers to the fundamental questions of human existence. Each had developed sophisticated understanding of agriculture, astronomy, architecture, and governance. And then, in a remarkably brief period, all three civilizations were confronted by something they could not have anticipated. The arrival of Europeans brought diseases, weapons, animals, and ideas that would transform the Americas forever. The story of contact is complex and varies for each civilization. For the Maya, European contact was actually less catastrophic in some ways because the classic Maya collapse had already occurred centuries earlier. When Spanish conquistadors first arrived on the Yucatan coast in 1517, they found not a unified empire, but a collection of independent city-states, some thriving, some in decline. Cities like Mayapan had risen and fallen. Other cities continued, maintaining Maya traditions, speaking Maya languages, preserving elements of the ancient culture. The Spanish conquest of the Maya took decades and was never complete. The terrain favored defenders. Thick jungle, no navigable rivers in much of the region, a hot and humid climate that Europeans found unbearable. The Maya fought back fiercely, using their knowledge of the landscape, disappearing into the forest, conducting guerrilla warfare. The last independent Maya kingdom, Tayasal in Guatemala, did not fall until 1697, 176 years after the fall of the Aztec Empire. For the Aztec, the collision was more sudden and more devastating. Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico in February of 1519 with about 600 men, a handful of horses, and some small cannons. He should have been nothing more than an annoyance to an empire of millions. But Cortés was shrewd, ruthless, and extraordinarily lucky. He quickly learned about the resentment of subject peoples toward Aztec rule. He made alliances with the Totonacs and Sempoalans on the coast, then marched inland. In Tlaxcala, after initial hostilities, Cortés gained his most important allies. The Tlaxcalans had resisted Aztec conquest for generations. They were fierce warriors, and they hated the Mexica. When Cortés offered them the chance to join him against their ancient enemies, they agreed. With thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors, Cortés was no longer a small band of foreigners. He was the leader of a significant military force, a force that grew as more disaffected peoples joined him. In November 1519, this combined force entered Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma, the Aztec Tlatoani, had been receiving reports of these strangers for months. He sent gifts, including gold, hoping perhaps to persuade them to leave. Instead, the gold only increased Spanish interest. Moctezuma made the fateful decision to allow Cortés and his men to enter the city as guests. Once inside, the Spanish took Moctezuma hostage, attempting to rule through him. This arrangement collapsed in May 1520 during a festival. Spanish soldiers, possibly acting without Cortés's orders, massacred hundreds of Aztec nobles and commoners during a ceremony in the Templo Mayor. The city erupted in rage. The Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies fought their way out of Tenochtitlan, suffering heavy casualties in what became known as the Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Moctezuma died during the fighting, either killed by Spanish swords or by stones thrown by his own angry people. But Cortés regrouped. He returned with more allies, more weapons, and an invisible ally far deadlier than any weapon. Smallpox had arrived in Mexico, probably brought by an infected African slave in the Spanish force. The disease spread through Tenochtitlan, killing thousands, including Cuitlahuac, who had succeeded Moctezuma. The Aztec had no immunity to European diseases. What Europeans experienced as a serious but survivable illness killed indigenous Americans in staggering numbers. The siege of Tenochtitlan lasted nearly 3 months. Cortés built small ships to control the lake, cutting off the city's supply routes. His indigenous allies numbered in the tens of thousands, far outnumbering the Spanish. The Aztec defenders fought with desperate courage, defending every street, every building. But they were weakened by disease and hunger. On August 13th, 1521, the last Aztec Tlatoani, Cuauhtémoc, was captured. The siege ended. The Aztec Empire fell. For the Inca, the pattern was similar, but even more tragic. Francisco Pizarro arrived on the coast of Peru in 1532 with fewer than 200 men. He found an empire in turmoil. The civil war between Huáscar and Atahualpa, the two sons of Huayna Capac, had just ended with Atahualpa's victory. The empire was divided, exhausted by war, its people uncertain about which ruler to follow. Atahualpa, confident in his massive army, agreed to meet with Pizarro in the town of Cajamarca. He brought thousands of warriors, but no weapons, seeing the meeting as a diplomatic encounter. Pizarro, taking a lesson from Cortez's playbook, sprung a trap. Spanish soldiers, hidden around the plaza, opened fire with their guns. Cavalry charged. In the chaos and terror, thousands of Inca were killed. Atahualpa was captured. The Sapper Inca, the son of the sun, the living god, was now a prisoner. Atahualpa offered a ransom. He promised to fill a room with gold and another twice over with silver. For months, gold and silver poured in from across the empire, carried by loyal subjects desperate to free their ruler. The Spanish melted it down, destroying artistic treasures of incalculable cultural value, turning sculptures and vessels into bars of bullion. When the ransom was paid, Pizarro did not release Atahualpa. Instead, after a mock trial, he executed him. The death of the Sapper Inca should have ended Inca resistance, but the empire was vast and complex, and various factions continued to fight, sometimes against the Spanish, sometimes against each other. A puppet emperor, Manco Inca, eventually rebelled and established a neo-Inca state in the remote mountains of Vilcabamba, where Inca culture survived in diminished form until 1572. The fall of these empires was not solely due to Spanish military superiority. The Spanish had advantages: horses, which provided mobility and shock value in battle; steel armor and weapons, which were superior to obsidian and bronze; and guns, which, though slow to reload and not very accurate, made terrifying noise and could penetrate shields and armor. But the Spanish were vastly outnumbered, fighting in unfamiliar terrain, far from reinforcement. What truly enabled Spanish conquest was disease. Smallpox, typhus, influenza, and other European diseases swept through the Americas, killing millions. In some regions, 90% of the indigenous population died within a century of contact. Entire communities were wiped out. Knowledge was lost as elders died before they could pass on their learning. Social structures collapsed. This demographic catastrophe was unprecedented in human history. The Spanish also exploited internal divisions. The Aztec Empire was held together by force and threat. Subject peoples had no loyalty to Tenochtitlan. When the Spanish offered them a chance to overthrow their oppressors, tens of thousands joined the rebellion. The Inca Empire was torn by civil war when the Spanish arrived. The conflict between Atahualpa and Huáscar had killed thousands and left deep resentments. Some Inca factions saw the Spanish as potential allies against their rivals. The conquest brought massive changes to the Americas. The Spanish imposed their language, their religion, their political systems. They destroyed temples and built churches on the ruins. They burned books, considering them pagan and demonic. Of the thousands of Maya codices that once existed, only 4 survived the conquest. Aztec codices fared slightly better because some Spanish priests recognized their historical value and worked with indigenous scribes to preserve information. But still, immense amounts of knowledge were lost. Yet despite the destruction, much survived. The people themselves survived, though in reduced numbers. Their languages continued, evolving, adapting, incorporating Spanish words, but maintaining their core structure and identity. Today, millions of people speak Maya languages, Nahuatl, Quechua. These are living languages, not archaeological curiosities. They are used in homes, in markets, in ceremonies, in the everyday life of communities that maintain connections to their ancestral past. Agricultural knowledge survived and spread. The crops domesticated by indigenous Americans transformed the world. Potatoes, originally from the Andes, became a staple food in Europe and Asia, supporting population growth. Maize spread worldwide, becoming one of the most important cereal crops. Tomatoes, peppers, chocolate, vanilla, pumpkins, beans, peanuts, all gifts from the Americas, enriched global cuisine beyond measure. Today, a world without these foods is almost unimaginable. Astronomical knowledge survived in fragments. The Maya calendar, though no longer used for all its original purposes, is still maintained by daykeepers in highland Guatemala, counting the cycles of time as their ancestors did. The precision of that calendar, the mathematical sophistication behind it, remains a source of pride and wonder. In 2012, when the Western media worried about Maya predictions of an apocalypse, actual Maya people were bemused. They knew the calendar simply marked the completion of a cycle and the beginning of a new one. Architectural techniques survived. In Mexico and Central America, in the Andes, people still build with traditional methods, adapting ancient knowledge to modern needs. The terraces carved into Andean hillsides by Inca engineers are still used for agriculture, still productive after 500 years. The raised chinampas of Mexico, though reduced in area, still produce crops in the remnants of Lake Texcoco. Artistic traditions survived and evolved. Weaving techniques passed from mother to daughter across generations. The textile patterns of highland Guatemala and the Andes encode symbols and stories thousands of years old. The brilliant colors, the intricate designs, these are living connections to pre-Columbian ancestors. Modern indigenous artists work with traditional techniques and motifs, creating works that honor the past while speaking to the present. Spiritual beliefs survived, though often hidden or blended with Christianity. The practice of leaving offerings at huacas, sacred places, continues in the Andes. Shamans still burn copal incense in Maya ceremonies. The deities were given Christian names, but their essence remained. The Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico, the Virgin of Copacabana in Bolivia, these are powerful female figures who blend Catholic and indigenous attributes, revered by millions with devotion that draws on both traditions. The physical structures survived, those the jungle and earthquakes did not reclaim. Teotihuacan, abandoned long before the Spanish arrived, still stands with its massive pyramids. Tenochtitlan is gone, buried under Mexico City, but archaeologists have excavated the Templo Mayor, revealing its layers of construction and offerings. The Maya cities, swallowed by jungle, have been rediscovered and studied. Tikal, Palenque, Chichen Itza, Copan. These are no longer lost but accessible, places where modern people can walk the same plazas the ancient Maya walked. In Peru, Machu Picchu, never found by the Spanish, remained hidden in its mountain fastness until its rediscovery in 1911. Now it is one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world, a place where the extraordinary skill of Inca stonemasons can be appreciated by millions. Cusco itself retains Inca walls and foundations, Spanish colonial buildings rising from Inca bases, a physical embodiment of cultural layering. The legacy of these civilizations extends beyond cultural survival. Modern scholars increasingly recognize that the Maya, Aztec, and Inca were not primitive societies, but complex civilizations with their own sophisticated understanding of the world. Their achievements in mathematics, astronomy, engineering, agriculture, and governance were remarkable, accomplished without many of the tools and technologies that Old World civilizations had. The Maya concept of zero, developed independently, is fundamental to mathematics and computing. The Aztec organization of their tribute empire, with its detailed record-keeping and administrative hierarchy, demonstrated sophisticated governance. The Inca road system, the Quipu recording method, the agricultural terraces, these were solutions to problems of scale and geography that remain impressive by any standard. These civilizations also remind us that there are multiple paths to complexity. The Maya built great cities without metal tools, without the wheel, without beasts of burden. The Inca administered a vast empire without writing as we understand it. They show us that human ingenuity can solve problems in ways that don't always match the patterns we might expect from Eurasian history. Today, the descendants of the Maya, Aztec, and Inca continue to live throughout the Americas. They are not frozen in the past, not museum exhibits or historical curiosities. They are modern people facing modern challenges, maintaining connections to ancestral traditions while navigating contemporary life. Some live in remote villages, much as their ancestors did. Others live in cities, working in offices, using computers, watching television, yet still speaking their ancestral languages at home, still observing traditional ceremonies, still identifying with indigenous heritage. The movement for indigenous rights has gained strength in recent decades. In Mexico, Guatemala, Peru, Bolivia, and other countries with large indigenous populations, there are ongoing struggles for land rights, political representation, cultural preservation, and recognition. In 2005, Bolivia elected its first indigenous president, Evo Morales, an Aymara man who took his oath of office at the ruins of Tiwanaku, an ancient city that predated the Inca, connecting his presidency symbolically to the deep past. The study of these civilizations continues to evolve. New archaeological discoveries provide fresh insights. The decipherment of Maya glyphs, largely accomplished in the late 20th century, revolutionized our understanding of Maya history and society. Excavations at the Templo Maya in Mexico City, ongoing since 1978, continue to reveal offerings and structures that expand our knowledge of Aztec religion and ritual. In Peru, new Inca sites are discovered regularly in the remote mountains, places that may never have been recorded by the Spanish. Technologies like LiDAR, which uses laser scanning to see through jungle canopy, have revealed that Maya cities were far larger and more complex than previously believed. Entire landscapes of agricultural terraces, causeways, and settlements have been mapped, showing that the Maya supported dense populations through intensive agriculture and sophisticated landscape management. What we once thought were small ceremonial centers in jungle wilderness now appear to have been vast urban areas surrounded by heavily modified agricultural land. These discoveries challenge old narratives about the collapse of Maya civilization. Rather than seeing a mysterious disappearance, we now understand a complex transformation driven by environmental stress, political fragmentation, and social change. The Maya did not vanish. They adapted, moved, reorganized. Some cities fell while others rose. The culture continued, changed, but unbroken. As we come to the end of this journey through three great civilizations, certain patterns emerge. All three developed in challenging environments and turned those challenges into advantages. The Maya made the jungle productive through careful management. The Aztec transformed a swampy lake into an agricultural wonderland. The Inca built their empire in the vertical world of mountains, using altitude as a resource. All three developed sophisticated understanding of astronomy and time, seeing patterns in the heavens and applying that knowledge to agriculture and ritual. All three were deeply religious societies where the boundary between sacred and secular was fluid or non-existent. Kings were sacred figures, mediators between human and divine. Rituals maintained cosmic order. The gods required offerings to sustain the world. This can seem alien to modern secular mindsets, but it was a coherent worldview that provided meaning, structure, and purpose to millions of lives across centuries. Also remind us of impermanence. The classic Maya cities fell silent. The Aztec Empire lasted barely 2 centuries before conquest. The Inca expanded rapidly but fell just as quickly. Nothing lasts forever. Power rises and declines. Cities are built and abandoned. Empires emerge and dissolve. This is not unique to the Americas, but a universal pattern in human history. Yet what these civilizations created continues to matter. The knowledge they developed enriches us all. The beauty they produced inspires us. The problems they solved inform how we think about sustainability, agriculture, governance, community. And their descendants carry forward traditions and identities that connect the living present to the deep past, maintaining threads of continuity across the rupture of conquest. As you drift towards sleep, let yourself feel the weight of centuries, the depth of time these civilizations span. Picture the Maya scribe in his stone room, painting glyphs by firelight, recording dates thousands of years into the past and future. Picture the Aztec farmer on his chinampa, harvesting maize as the sun rises over the lake. Picture the Inca runner on the mountain road, sprinting through thin air, carrying messages across the empire. These were real people, living real lives, solving real problems, creating beauty, raising children, worshipping gods, loving and fearing and hoping. The pyramids stand under the stars. The terraces climb the mountainsides. The causeways cross the lake, or would if the lake had not been drained. The past is not truly past. It lives in languages still spoken, crops still grown, patterns still woven, ceremonies still performed. It lives in the stones that will not fall, in the stories still told, in the blood and memory of millions of descendants. Rest now in this knowledge. Rest in the long twilight of these civilizations, not ended but transformed, not lost but changed, not absent but present in ways both subtle and profound. The ancestors watch from the mountains, from the jungle, from the stars. The cycles turn. Time moves in sacred patterns. The maize grows, season after season. Life continues. Let the quiet hold you. Let the centuries pile up like layers. In a pyramid, each one supporting the next, reaching toward the sky. Let yourself rest in the peace of understanding that civilizations rise and fall, but the human capacity for creation, for adaptation, for survival continues. Sleep now. Dream of pyramids and terraces, of canals and mountains, of cities in the jungle and cities on the lake and cities in the clouds. Dream of the Maya, the Aztec, the Inca, those remarkable peoples who built worlds and left legacies that echo still in the present day. Dream and rest. The story continues even as you sleep.